Please take your seats. Jerusalem Post. He's Director of Global Research in International Affairs. Well known, without giving you the full title, what he's going to talk about tonight is giving us an understanding of what's really going on, certainly as it applies to the state of Israel. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Barry Rubin.
Thank you very much for kindly hosting me, and my thanks to all the people who organized this event. I'm going to speak a little bit about what we do at the Gloria Center. I'm going to speak a little bit about my new book on Israel, and then I'm going to speak a fair amount about the current situation in the Middle East. But let me begin by saying that I'm sure you've all heard the joke. What does a Jewish telegram say? It says, start worrying, letter follows. So I'm going to change it a bit, and my telegram to you tonight will be, stop worrying, lecture follows. The Middle East studying the Middle East is a growth industry. I've been doing it now professionally for almost 40 years. It's become very popular because, of course, of all the events in the region, Iranian Revolution, September 11th, you name it. And so everyone has become an expert on the Middle East. There's an infinite amount of material. A lot of this material is polemical, attacking Israel or defending Israel. Research centers and individuals have sprung up, and one could easily spend 24 hours a day. Personally, I spend about 16 reading and looking at all this various material. The problem is that very little of it's any good. Because to study the region, to really try to understand it, you have to do so very seriously. Not with a prior agenda in mind, not using second and third hand materials, and from a real understanding of how the Middle East works, the societies work, the people think, that's so often lacking. This is something I could give a talk on, but I'm not going to do it. So what we do at the Gloria Center is we look at really important issues and that are not getting the proper attention and then try to deal with them. 2.5 years ago, first time I've ever actually said this in public, we hosted a secret conference on what would it look like if Israel were to attack Iranian nuclear facilities. My colleague, Dr. Jonathan Spire, has just spent a number of days in Syria, studying the upheaval there. He's been in northern Iraq. We're looking at a lot of important issues. We're following the developments in the post-quote Arab Spring, end-quote countries on a daily basis. And we produce a lot of material. If you're not familiar with it, I write my own blog called Rubin Reports. I also write for PJ Media, and we do a lot of stuff also in the Jerusalem Post. So we're really trying to deal with this very, very seriously and very, very accurately. Now this brings me to the book on Israel. Because here we are, 60 years after the independence of Israel as a state, and in my personal opinion, there was not a single book which told the comprehensive story of Israel as an actually existing country. There were endless amounts of wars, Arab-Israeli conflict, all sorts of nonsense being produced by Western academia, but there was not in one volume a book which described the country and talked about its economy, its culture, its politics, its people, its society, as well as its history and the international aspects of it. So we set out to provide such a book, and we've now done so through Yale University Press, and I hope you find it interesting. With the greatest pleasure, even though it hasn't been out very long, is people live in Israel and say that they learn new things from it. It's also very appropriate as a present, and we try to make it very readable. Now, I'll just say very briefly, there are two main themes in the book. One is Israel is an actual country. with an actually distinct society, worldview, and so on of its own. It's a country that people think they know a lot about and often know very little about. It's a country that some people demonize and some people sanctify. But overall, even being critical, it's not a bad place at all. The second theme is one that many of you are old enough to remember, but we haven't heard enough of in recent years. Israel as a major, huge, remarkable success story, and even a miracle. And then being Israeli, I have to quickly add after that, despite all the problems and shortcomings. This is what we tried to capture in the book. I think we've succeeded. I hope some of you will read it, or buy it. We have it outside for your perusal if you're so interested. Now let me then turn to the question, well, so what is the status of Israel, I'm going to focus internationally, in the year 2012? How do we understand the dramatic changes in the Middle East and how they affect Israel? So I'll say at the very beginning the following. There's been a huge amount of misinformation and misunderstanding about the developments of the last year. They pose real problems for the security of Israel. But on balance, we're much better off than we've been in the past, and there are ways that we can deal with these issues. So what are some of the main themes that we should emphasize? The first theme is, we are in a totally new era in the Middle East. We've lived and studied and read and looked at the Middle East as it's been since about 1952. That is a Middle East dominated by Arab nationalism, by Arab identity, by Arab states having a conflict over who's going to rule the region, who's going to lead the region. And the Arab-Israeli conflict has been an important factor in this era. Not as important as many people think, not the only issue, but an important issue. And that era is now at an end because Arab nationalism failed. It failed to deliver on its international promises. It didn't unite the Arabs. It didn't destroy Israel. It didn't expel Western influence. And it failed on its internal domestic promises to bring higher living standards and rapid development. We were aware of these failures as early as the 1980s and into the 1990s. 1990s at times made one believe that perhaps the system could change itself and make peace with Israel, but it failed. And finally now, this system, which is so powerful and so solid, has now largely collapsed almost overnight. That era is over, and we have to adjust ourselves to understanding and dealing with the new era. Principle number 2, the new era is characterized by a struggle between modern democratic forces and revolutionary Islamist forces, and the revolutionary Islamist forces in almost every case will win. So we've gone from the Arab nationalist era to an era dominated by revolutionary Islamism. A doctrine which says that the most important mark of identity for people is religion, is Islam, that countries should be ruled by Islamic law. And in addition to that, also says that the reason Arab nationalism failed was not, as the moderates say, because it didn't learn from Western experience and Asian experience. It didn't fail because it didn't turn away from violence and extremism. It failed because it wasn't violent and extremist enough. Now, there's a little story I used to illustrate this that people always relate to. The Arab nationalists say that the Arabic-speaking peoples and Muslim peoples in the Middle East have been hitting their head against a stone wall for 60 years, and that they should keep hitting their head against the stone wall. The moderates say that it's foolish to hit your head against a stone wall, that you will not succeed. So get along with the West. Learn the lessons that other countries like China and South Korea and Japan and others have learned. stop trying to destroy Israel, adopt democratic norms, have equality for women so that you do not throw away that resource, and so on. Or in other words, whereas the Arab nationalists say keep hitting your head against a stone wall, the moderates say stop hitting yourself heads against a stone wall. But the Islamists, the third group, say the problem, the mistake you've made is that you have not hit your head hard enough against that stone wall. And therefore, these people are determined to repeat all the mistakes made by the Arab nationalists for 60 years. Hostility to the West, hostility to Israel, an emphasis on mobilization and ideology and repression at home. And as a result, while on the one hand, these societies are going to be as hostile or more hostile to Israel, they're also going to be much weaker in trying to carry out those threats. The third principle is that the West has been largely blind to the development that I just told you about. It literally, I'm not exaggerating here, seems as if every 48 hours the New York Times runs an article about how moderate the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood is. We are used to dealing with hostility to Israel or bias against Israel, and people used to always say, and still say, Israel is the canary in the coal mine, meaning that Israel is the early warning against other things that are going to come. Well, the canary sounded off, and the cave-in happened in the coal mine. It's not just on the issue of Israel that we see this kind of misinformation. It's almost every aspect of the Middle East. Turkey is not presented as a country ruled by a radical Islamist regime which sabotages Western goals, which is increasingly repressive at home, but is a democratic model for other societies. Egypt is not seen as a country which is sliding under the control of radical Muslim Brotherhood and radical Salafists, but as a country that's headed for democracy. And the list goes on and on. In other words, if we were talking 20 years ago, we would complain on Israel-Palestinian Arab-Israeli issues. It's terrible, it's awful, there's a slant, everybody has their own idea. Well, now it's true for every issue almost in the region. And that's the problem. Let's take a look at Egypt, which in my opinion, Egypt and not Iran is the most important issue and poses the greatest challenge to Israel. In the next few days, Egypt will begin the presidential election. There are a lot of questions about how this election will be conducted. We know that in the parliamentary elections, the Muslim Brotherhood got 50%, 48%. The Salafists got about 25%. That adds up to almost 75%. What's going to happen in the presidential election? Some of the Muslim Brotherhood voters will possibly vote for Amr Musa or another secular candidate. But we basically have two likely outcomes. The next president of Egypt will either be Amr Musa, who is a radical nationalist who hates America and hates Israel, but has a streak of pragmatism, or it will be, most likely, Abdel Fattah, who is a front for the Muslim Brotherhood, even though we're daily told that he's really a moderate and has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood. This poses a severe challenge. When I talk to government officials in various countries, when I talk to diplomats in various countries, they say, well, we don't have to worry because they have to deal with domestic issues. They have to they want to get the American aid, and they have to keep the army happy. So therefore, this is just a little case study of the absurdity of analysis of the Middle East. So I say, well, look, first of all, we saw that 16 Americans were indicted as basically spies and subversives for helping non-governmental organizations. And basically what happened is that $4 million in ransom was paid to get them out of the country. So if they're so afraid of losing American aid. Why did they push this minor issue to the point of breaking? In addition, we have seen a pattern in the history of Middle East politics where regimes fail to deal with domestic problems. They can't provide jobs. They can't provide housing. They can't provide good living for their people. So what do? They do, one, repression, two, demagoguery about who's to blame, meaning the West and Israel, and three, foreign adventures. So they have an alternative. And they cannot solve the domestic problems of Egypt. So we have to be very concerned after late June or early July, when there's a new Egyptian president, what policies is that country going to follow? Now again, to me, that's the most important issue in the region, and it's an issue that has gone virtually undiscussed by anyone in the West, and it's an issue that we've tried to deal with to a great extent. A second critical issue, which I'm going to deal with in an abbreviated fashion, is Iranian nuclear. Iran's attempts to get nuclear weapons. Now, as some of you who read my work know, I am not in favor of an Israeli attack on Iran for various reasons which I can discuss. But we are beyond that point because it seems very likely that the decision has been made that this is going to be Israeli policy. So at this point, there are other things we need to talk about. When would such an attack happen? I definitely do not think this year. What would it look like, and what would be the repercussions afterward? Again, and how do you deal with those repercussions? Again, this is an issue that I don't think has received enough attention, despite all these people blabbering on about Iran, and often saying the most absurd things. But in terms of analysis, an example is what has just happened at the AIPAC meeting and with Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington and with President Obama's speech. And again, I think that the debate is misfocused. It is quite possible that President Obama only said what he did as an election ploy, but it doesn't matter because, and I can go into it in more detail, because he has set up a policy, in my opinion, in a sequence of events that will inevitably lead, not this year, but 2013, 2014, conceivably 2015, to an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear facilities that the United States will have to support. I don't know if any of you read, I wrote a satire, I call it a serious satire, in which I portrayed a phone conversation between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama as the Israeli planes were taking off, in which Netanyahu simply quoted large portions of Obama's speech to justify it. So we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that issue, and we should be prepared beforehand to do so. A third issue which we need to address is the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israel-Palestinian issue. People continue to speak absurd things about this. Recently, a Canadian newspaper carried an op-ed piece which said that there had to be a settlement between Israel and Palestinians so that this would cool things, and Iran, therefore, wouldn't hate Israel, and the Iranian regime wouldn't attack Israel. I mean, there's nothing too nonsensical that won't be said about the Middle East. But most people understand, even people who don't love Israel, that this issue, Arab-Israeli, Israel-Palestinian, has become less and less important in regional terms. Things have moved beyond that. And because we're out of that old Arab nationalist era, and we did not enter into a modern era, there is no chance that there is going to be a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. People were just, Israeli government officials were just telling me that in the last few days, another delegation has arrived from Europe in which they argued that it was absolutely imperative that Israel and Palestinians make a deal immediately. Now, I would say that the reason that we have not had a peace agreement is because the Palestinian leadership simultaneously doesn't want a peaceful two-state solution, and at the same time is too weak to deliver one even if they wanted to. This is a long topic, and you're familiar with it, but very briefly, the problem is they still entertain hopes of getting everything. And they have created so much pressure in their society that no Palestinian leader can make the necessary compromises. So they don't want to, and to the extent they want to, they can't. Now this isn't exactly a secret. But part of the reason, well, there are two interesting points here. Why people generally understand this, leaving aside propaganda and stuff. One reason is to understand what I just said, the Palestinians do not want to or cannot make an agreement with Israel, is counterintuitive in terms of Western logic. And remember, that's why it's always a mistake to transfer Western experience and Western thinking to the Middle East. In terms of Western thinking, the argument goes, the Palestinians are suffering, they're miserable, they desperately want to stay, they're the weaker party, it's clear they can't win militarily, therefore they must be desperate to have a state. And simultaneously, Israel is the stronger side, they control the territory, they're much more affluent, so if there's no deal, it must be the stronger side that's refusing to make a deal, so it must be Israel's fault. Now this really makes total sense in terms of Western thinking. It's our argument that doesn't make sense in terms of Western thinking because it's a Middle Eastern political situation. That if people believe that they can win total victory, that only total victory, the annihilation of Israel is just, that Allah is on their side, that anyone who proposes the slightest compromise is a traitor, who may be killed, but more likely their political career would be ruined. When we add these factors, then we can understand why it is that the Palestinians are the ones refusing to make peace, and why it's so incredibly difficult for Westerners to understand this. But we know that. The second interesting thing is, and you can go into the search on the internet, nobody publicly makes a serious effort to study Palestinian politics. So I have analyzed every member of the Palestinian National Council. I have analyzed every member of the Fatah Central Committee. I mean, we really study these people. And what you see, for example, I think, don't hold me to this, there are about 19 to 22 members of the Fatah Central Committee today. And I wouldn't, and I'm being generous, I wouldn't say that more than 3 of them are moderates. Some of them are Fatah people, some of them are Arafat people, and they're corrupt and they benefit from the status quo, but they can't see making compromises. And the rest of them are like revolutionary Fatah people who, are consciously and systematically more hardline. So if you study Palestinian political leadership, you know they can't make a deal. But nobody does that, they just speak a priority. So we are in a period when the peace process is dead, or as my colleague Greg Rubin wants me to say, dormant, like Rip Van Winkle. In other words, for a whole historical period. Is this understood in the rest of the world? Part of the problem is that while there were certainly many Israelis who said this throughout the 1990s, by the year 2000, I think you had a national consensus in Israel that this was true. This consensus has never been the Western public has never been informed of what people in Israel actually think. And to this day, they don't understand it, although more people understand it than before. So the Arab-Israeli conflict as such, the Israel-Palestinian conflict as such, is not important. Now, my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Spire, wrote an excellent book, which I highly recommend to you on this topic, about the transformation of the conflict into, and not an Arab nationalist or Arab Marxist, but an Islamist conflict. And that's true. But on a regional basis, it's far less important than it was before. What's important in the region, and this is sort of a normal political thing, is the struggle for state power, the struggle to control the ideology, and the struggle to control the countries. How then, having talked about these things, having told you that we are not entering an era of peace and stability, but an era of continued conflict and instability, how can I then say that from our point of view, this is not a horrible and pessimistic analysis? And the answer is for very good reasons, of which I will give you several. Number one, with all its faults and shortcomings, Israel remains strong and is arguably fundamentally more united, especially on the issues I'm talking about, than it has been, certainly since the 1970s. That people have, again, with all the problems and social protests and so on, that people have the proper orientation, which is you work to make your living and make the society work, to make money, to make products, to criticize yourself in order to try to make things better. One of the most interesting things you have to do is to explain to foreign diplomats and people from different countries that when you hear that self-criticism is Israel's national sport, that adrenaline is its national enzyme, other countries have national birds and plant flowers, we have a national enzyme, and that it can be a very good thing which can make a society stronger. And that in dictatorships, I can tell you some wonderful anecdotes that I'm editing out because of time, but in dictatorships in countries where you cannot have that discussion and that lively debate and that self-criticism, they're much weaker. So Israel is strong. It has, even though people differ, it has a basically realistic view of the situation. It is without illusions, generally speaking, and that's a good thing. A second theme is that precisely because what we see now is a struggle for state power, that means that for many years to come, Israel's enemies, however much they attack us verbally and even support terrorism and do other things, are going to be very badly divided. It's not, as the Western narrative would put it, that the governments are working on their domestic problems, which would be a productive thing. It's that these people are fighting each other and killing each other. And that is not a productive thing. In Egypt and Tunisia, we are going to see tremendous battles. We are going to see the Salafists pushing on the Muslim Brotherhood, complaining that it isn't doing enough, even waging on struggle and terrorism against it. We are going to be seeing the attempt to portray an illusion to the West, that they're not going too far too fast, that they're not really radical states, which will have some effect. And we will have really stupid programs which will make their economies stagnate, which will make their educational systems worse, which will make their armies less effective as they put people in because of their ideological position rather than their competence. Now, I am not rejoicing at the sufferings of others. I am simply observing them and analyzing how they affect us. This is what I see. In Libya, in addition to that, you have terrible regional conflicts. In Syria, you have a terrible and bloody civil war. And everywhere you look, you see these internal conflicts are going to increase. Now remember something. While there certainly was turmoil in the Arab world, particularly in the 1950s and 60s, if you want, I will cite you a list of the coups in Syria between 1949 and 1970. I think there were at least 8 successful ones. That these countries did operate as units. They were effective as nation states, and they could confront Israel as states. This is no longer the situation. On top of that, a new conflict is developing, and that is the conflict between the Sunni and the Shia Muslim worlds. This is going to be a huge feature of the coming years. Remember something. From 1979 to a year ago, Iran was the only, to some extent, was the only game in town. In other words, it was the only real Islamist state. And so you had to decide if you wanted their sponsorship. But now the Sunni Islamists have made a big advance. They rule Egypt, they rule Tunisia, they rule the Gaza Strip, and I think soon they'll rule Libya. And these people do not need Iran, and they do not like Shias. In fact, sometimes you read the saying the Shias are worse than the Zionists. I'll show you various articles that people said that. These two sides are going to fight for influence, and they are not going to cooperate. Now, there are a lot of details that I could throw in here, but I will give you the short version for the moment. Still, another feature of the regional picture is that from 1952, pretty much, certainly to 1980, and even beyond, the struggle for power in the Middle East was a struggle among Arab states. That is no longer true. There are two additional contenders, Turkey and Iran. Turkey, Sunni Muslim, but not Arab. Iran, Shia Muslim, and not Arab. And what's happened in the last year, it was a victory for Islamists, it was a victory for Sunni Islamists. It was a defeat for Iran. The last year has been very bad for Iranian ambitions. A year ago or more, it was conceivable that the Iranians could drive to become the leader of the Muslim world, to become the leader of the Middle East. That is no longer true. Once you get beyond Iraq, Lebanon, basically, they do not have assets. A wall has been built across, limiting them. That is very significant. And to the extent they understand this, I don't know, but most obviously they have lost control of Hamas. Hamas, and hence the Gaza Strip, has gone with the Egyptians. They'll be happy to keep taking Iranian money, but they are no longer instruments of Iranian foreign policy. As we've seen with the firing of rockets in recent days, Iran has moved to Islamic Jihad and the Palestinian resistance committees, which are much smaller. So Iranian ambitions have been curtailed. In Syria, there's a bloody civil war, essentially being fought against Iran's power. Iran is trying to help the Syrian regime, and they will succeed, but they will leave a broken country that will not be able to pose a direct threat to Israel. So the Sunni-Shia conflict is significant. The anti-Iranian Islamist factor is significant. As for Turkey, a country I'm very interested in, I'm happy to talk the entire time about Turkey. They were too ambitious and the leadership is too obnoxious, and basically have been shut down. And they too face a wall, they face the Arab wall. So you have now a battle between all of these forces. They are not cooperating, they are in conflict. An additional positive factor from our viewpoint is the absolute fear of the revolutionary Islamists on the part of a lot of people in the Middle East. This is the first time, really, in the history of Israel, where we have people, significant forces. I'm not going to say I joke about this, I'm not going to say they're our allies. Some of them despise us. They will not cooperate with us beyond a certain point, but their interests are parallel to ours. And if you look at WikiLeaks, and if you know people behind the scenes, and again, I can tell you anecdotes about this, in private, they often make little secret. They hate and fear the Islamists. They hate and fear Iran. and they don't look at Israel as the main threat to them. This includes, of course, Morocco and Algeria, and Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and the smaller countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. It includes the oppositions in many countries, including Iran and Turkey and Lebanon, among others, whose interests are parallel to ours. Now let me just give you two brief examples. Number one, in my opinion, Israel's greatest, quote, ally, end quote, in Lebanon has been Saudi Arabia. Not because they love us, but because they do not want an Iranian, Syrian-controlled regime in Lebanon. They do not want an Iranian Islamist regime in Bahrain, and they send troops there. And there are many other examples. The second case was a very important person. He's actually the police chief of Abu Dhabi, but like one of the best strategic minds in the Arab side of the Gulf, recently gave a major public lecture on security threats to the Gulf Arab states. He listed 46 security threats to Arab states. Israel is not on the list. There was one short paragraph about Israel, which he says, and of course to support the Palestinians. And that was it. That increasingly these countries know that strong Israel, and Israel that combats the Islamists, even in Israel that attacks Iranian nuclear installations, is objectively in their interests. And even though there's a limit to what they will do, and even more on what they will say, that is an incredible strategic asset for Israel that never existed before. So, even though the situation in many ways is bad, we have a more hostile government in Egypt. We have a more hostile government in Lebanon. We have a more hostile government in Egypt. We have Iran working on the nuclear weapons. The Israel alliance with Turkey has broken down, which we knew for years. We knew for years these people were Islamists, but we didn't want to be the ones responsible to break. These are very visible negatives. I would suggest that the positives outweigh the negatives. However, how many minutes do I have? Good. There's one other factor which, at least for the moment, has to do with the negative side, and that's the United States. Who would think that we'd be able to say that Israel could not, even with various problems in the past, that Israel could not depend on the U.S. government? Who would say that Israel, no matter how many times the president says nice things about Israel, who would think that Israel was no longer the ally, not really an ally in the Middle East that the U.S. relied on, was not Israel, but is in fact the Turkish Islamist regime? These are tremendous difficulties. Now, I should stress something important here. During the 3 years of the Obama administration, Israel has suffered virtually no material loss in terms of bilateral relations. After all the speeches and complaints and this and that, the other thing, the fact that I credit the Israeli government for handling this very well, among other things, Israel hasn't lost anything in its bilateral relation with the U.S. Israel has not been forced into any major concession. Israel has not been forced into any major risk. The problem for Israel is not in bilateral relations. It's in the abrogation of U.S. interests in the region. That a U.S. government I don't know if Libya could be worse. I'll leave that to Professor Romani, who's a Libya expert in the audience. But certainly, worse situation in Tunisia, worse situation in Egypt, worse situation in Lebanon, worse situation in Turkey, and the profound mistrust of people in the region for the U.S. government. Now, this is not just an Israeli thing. You look at WikiLeaks, and you see this expressed. The Saudis, amazing things happen. For example, in January and February of last year, the U.S. government, U.S. White House, State Department was against it. State Department was overruled. That's, by the way, another change we have to be aware of. Our problem in the United States is no longer with the State Department, but with another branch of another part of the U.S. government. That the U.S. government never had a serious consultation with Israel over what should happen with Egypt. It also never had a serious consultation with Jordan or Saudi Arabia either. And they are hopping mad. They feel betrayed. They feel they cannot rely on the U.S. government. And by the way, I could talk about Europe, and I could talk about countries in Latin America, and I could talk about countries in Asia, including the two countries with the biggest populations in the world that also feel that way. I'll quote one Arab who said privately, we don't want an American, from one of the Gulf countries, we don't want an American president who acts like an Arab, we want an American president who acts like an American. I will quote it. I'm not saying it. This is an Arab Gulfi who said it. And I will quote a Saudi who said privately, we look at you, Westerners, Christians, Jews, as part of the same family. So if you treat Israel, a member of your family, like that, how are you going to treat us? What I want to impress on you is things have really changed. And the Jewish people have survived for 3,000 or 4,000, whatever number of years we're going to it, because we have been sensitive to change. We have been open-minded about revising our views and revising our strategy and tactics. And what is necessary to be called on to do now is to do that once again in the face of very dramatic changes in the world, which do pose tremendous threats and challenges. But threats and challenges that we can meet if we are clever in figuring out how to do it. Now, every day almost in my writings, I provide details and quotations and footnotes on this. So if you're interested, you can see Rubin reports at blogspot.com. You can see our site, gloria-center.org, where we try to provide daily accounts which go into detail over these issues, and which always try to provide an independent perspective based on the evidence, based on years of experience, and based on close contacts with people from every country in the Middle East, even though we don't talk about it publicly necessarily, to try to understand these issues. Now, you've been very patient with me and very attentive, and I very much appreciate your time. And I hope that we can continue this dialogue not only in your questions, but as you read what I've written, what Dr. Spire has written, what others at Gloria Center have written, and of course you're welcome to write me in regard to that. And do take a look at our issue report. Thank you very much.
Professor Rubin, wonderful exposition on where we are today. You delivered as promised. Professor Rubin has agreed to accept questions, please. No speeches. Before we get to the first question, I do want to recognize Dr. Jonathan Spire, who's here, part of Gloria. Just came back from Syria and Iraq. If you recall that he spoke there last year when we launched his book, and Greg Roman, who hasn't launched his book yet, but is writing in the Jerusalem Post. I strongly urge you, get a copy of his book. First question. Please wait for the microphone.
By the way, well, I hope you'll have me back in about a year, because I'm publishing another book with Yale called Nazis, Islamists, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, which is based on hundreds of pages of recently released documents, many of them CIA documents, which will totally change your picture of Middle East history and of the importance of Nazi Germany and its doctrines in shaping the region.
I assure you this audience will want you back. We'll just have to set a date for it. First question.
I wish to thank you for your wonderful talk. I wish to thank you for your wonderful talk, and I really appreciate it. But in your talk, you did not mention Iraq Afghanistan and Pakistan. Why?
The question is, why did I mention Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan? The answer is because I was given 40 minutes. And if I may just say, every time I speak, I get this, why didn't you mention the question? And the answer is because I only have so much time and I have to stress the main themes. I just, today, have written an article, which I assume will publish sometime next week, called As Good as It Gets, Why Iraq is the Best Model for the Middle East. And then I go through all the problems with Iraq, and I say, but at least you got two things going on. First of all, you're a pluralist system, not a dictatorship. And you have decentralization instead of rigid centralization. And you have a country that at least is trying to deal with its problems and minding its own business, rather than trying to lead the entire Middle East and subverting all its neighbors. So I can talk about all the problems in Iraq. We should understand Iran definitely has influence in Iraq, but that influence in Iraq is limited. Iraq is not going to be, certainly at this point, an Iranian satellite. And in fact, therefore, Iraq is another failure of Iranian policy, even though they have agents there and launch attacks on Americans and stuff. Regarding Afghanistan, my view is that the idea that the U.S. was going to turn Afghanistan into a modern democratic country, to call that a fantasy is a gross understatement. By the way, I've never talked about my own personal secret trip to Afghanistan publicly, but maybe I'll do that some other time. Anyway, so I just think the U.S. should get out and have certain forces that it can depend on to keep out the Taliban. But the basic I'll tell you a story. I was at a conference. I have a very good friend who's a brilliant Afghan guy who works in intelligence stuff anyway. And some really pompous guy got up, I won't say his name, and talked about how great everything was going in Afghanistan. This Afghan got up and in 20 minutes demolished every point and said the army stays in the barracks, they don't interfere, the warlords run everything, on and on and on. So we shouldn't. It was necessary for the U.S. to go into Afghanistan and overthrow the Taliban government after September 11th. But U.S. interests and Western interests in Afghanistan is to keep radical Islamists out of power, not to reform or apologize or all this other stuff. Regarding Pakistan, it's a scam. We've been talking about it for years. Pakistan is behind the terrorists in India. It's behind some of the Taliban. They've been raking in billions of dollars, and they're not very reliable. American policy, which has begun to be rethought a bit, was just wrong. It was mistaken. So if you want to talk about problems and mistakes, it's a very long list.
Question from this side. Gentleman over there.
Okay, but he's not.
Just one moment, please.
You're not the one who's calling. This gentleman.
I would like to ask, in view of the fact that Palestinians left Syria, lately fleeing from Syria, in fear of a fall of Assad's regime, is there any chance that if Assad falls, Syria would serve as a haven for Al-Qaeda?
Okay. The question is, will Syria become a haven for Al-Qaeda? And I'm glad you asked the question about Syria, so here are my views. People say, well, what does Israel want in Syria? I say, the number one best thing that would happen is that Syria would become a relatively moderate state, along the lines of Iraq that it described, and would leave us alone. The worst outcome is that Syria would become a radical Islamist state, which would go back to attempting to launch a high level of conflict with Israel. And the intermediate thing would be that they go on fighting and Syria remains weak and therefore can't cause much trouble. We do not know precisely what would happen if Assad were overthrown. My view is that the moderate forces are much stronger in Syria than they were in Egypt. We should remember that only about 60% of the Syrian population are Sunni Muslim Arabs. You got the Kurds, you got the Christians, you got the Alawites, you got the Druze. These people do not tend to be radical Islamists. And then you have a stronger middle class and more stronger urban middle class. Very traditional society in many places. But the traditional Islam is a pre-Islamist Islam. So if you ask me, if Assad were to be overthrown, what do you think the chances are that a relatively moderate Syria would emerge as opposed to a radical Islamist Syria? I'd say, look, I think there'd be a real chance. But my view is we're not going to find out, because my view is that the regime is going to win, because the world is not going to lift a finger to help the opposition. So, in other words, I think the fighting will go on for a year, 2 years. The regime will win unless something happens. I have to reevaluate that. And then they'll still hate us and despise us and loathe us, but they'll be in less of a position to do something about it. Although, of course, they can always do some stuff through Lebanon. That basically, I think Gaza, you could argue that Gaza has become a safe haven for Al-Qaeda through the PRC, but that's not my, main concern. I mean, there's some really good people in the Syrian opposition. There's some really impressive people. But let me tell you a little story, and I hope you don't mind me saying this. I mean, I want to be honest, but I don't want to give you a misimpression, of my self-regard. I would simply say that, last week I did an interview with a major American radio program when I was emptying out the cat box, so I don't have pompous pretensions at all. Having said that, I think I'm literally the only person in the world who's written this story. The United States decided correctly that there should be a single Syrian opposition group which the world could give money to and support, and it would be the Syrians. So that's so far so good. So what did they do? They subcontracted the formation of this group to President Obama's good buddy, Prime Minister Erdogan, that is the Turkish Islamist regime. Now I think, 290 people, something like that? Okay, but they announced 19, the top steering committee. So I simply analyzed, who are these 19 people? And of the 19, 15 are Sunni Arab Muslims. 2 Christians, 2 Kurds. So these 15, 10 of them are Islamists. Muslim Brotherhood or Salafist Islamists. And the guy I most respect in the Syrian opposition tells me that in addition to those 10 of the 19, 2 more people who are nominally leftist or independent are also satellites of the Brotherhood. So what happened was that the U.S. government sponsored the formation of an anti-American Islamist leadership in Syria. Well, what happened? People were very unhappy in the Syrian opposition, and they didn't participate. They formed 6 other groups, and now 3 of the non-Islamists have resigned. So it was a failure. But this is the kind of insanity we're dealing with. Now, the New York Times coverage and some of the coverage mentioned, they had quotes. I'll publish this article tonight or tomorrow. They had some quotes from the people who resigned saying, this is Islamist run, but it didn't highlight this. This is the kind of insanity that we're dealing with. Now, this is not good for Israel, but I assure you that we are by no means in first place among the people who are suffering from this kind of behavior. I'm sorry, I went on with this interpretation.
Question from this side. Yes. No, lady to your right.
The question is, we keep reading about this march that the Muslims are going to do on Jerusalem. Is it really a threat? Do we have to worry about these millions of people coming?
Is this march a threat? Well, if you want, you can read 2 good documents on this. One is Udi Rosen, the JCPA, a detailed account, and the other is the Center for Special Studies, is that what it's called? This is basically an Iran-Hamas front group. My feeling is that, and from talking to people in the government involved with this, it's not that big a deal. That there's been a lot of talk, relatively little organization. Now it's set to coincide with the Israeli Arab Land Day. So I assume, there'll be big demonstrations in Gaza, some border, but I really don't think this is going to amount too much. This is sort of a typical example of people talking a lot, but talking instead of organizing. So if our enemies spend all their time talking about how horrible we are and how much they hate us, and then interferes with their actually doing anything about it, then that's not such a bad thing.
From the back. No, a gentleman with his hand up. First, second row.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm wondering what your thoughts are of the Egyptian army. They seem, in the past, they were the leaders, and they seem to have just evaporated it all. Is that?
Yesterday, someone said to me, I'm going to be very frank here. Someone said, the revolution in Egypt happened and no one predicted, no one knew about. Well, for like 2 years before, I have been working with various people who were predicting that this was going to happen. The mistake they made is that they thought it would happen when Mubarak died and they were disabled. And there was a lot of stuff that went on behind the scenes. What happened was that Mubarak so alienated the military and the main support of the regime, and they hated his son. They hated the idea that he would pass succession to his son. And so when the Muslim Brotherhood started, in a real sense, the demonstrations, the military would not protect Mubarak regime. People forget that the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia succeeded because the military supported them. So it's easy to have a revolution if the army supports you. We saw in Libya and Syria something very different. The military is mainly concerned with its own economic well-being. It controls a huge proportion of the Egyptian economy. They want the government, they do not want political power. I read over and over again, every day, the army's not going to hand over power. The army is the enemy. The army is the problem. I have never seen the tiniest shred of evidence that the army does not intend to turn over control to civilians. And I believe they will in late June, early July. So the army does not have political ambitions. It wants someone who will not bother the economic holdings of the officers and will not interfere in its budget. And they will make a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood to do that. One of the mistakes of the moderates was to focus on attacking the army with, not the most brilliant idea if you want to have an effect, and blaming the army and looking at the Muslim Brotherhood as the lesser of two evils. This is absurd. And when the Muslim Brotherhood were organizing for the parliamentary elections, the moderates were demonstrating in Tahrir Square against the army. I have the greatest sympathy for the genuine moderates, but I do not have a high regard for their political abilities. So, number one, the army wants a deal to secure its interests. They are happy to make such a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood. Number two, the officers are human and soldiers are human beings. This isn't the secularist Turkish army. Many of them are infected with Islamist views. Many of them are infected with radical nationalist views, which on foreign policy terms can get along with the Islamists. So this idea that the army is the bulwark against the Brotherhood of Islamists is absolute nonsense. And again, don't misunderstand me. I think that I can prove in 120 seconds that argument is absolute nonsense. And yet this is what we hear over and over again every day in the Western mass media. The army is the problem. The army doesn't want to turn it over to the civilians. But the army will be held by American aid and money. This is absolute nonsense. And junior army officers in Eastern Sinai are not necessarily going, even beyond that, they're not necessarily going to be bound by what people in the high command in Cairo decide. So the entire Western analysis, the mainstream Western analysis of Egypt is totally worthless, misleading. I think I can demonstrate it easily, but those people who think that way are not given the opportunity to do so because of certain changes that have happened in Western societies in recent years. So I hope that answers your question.
Two more questions, one from this side, gentleman over there.
By the way, what I'm about to say, I mean, you know, if you buy a book, I'll be happy to autograph it and I'll answer any questions you have after.
I do all the commercials.
How would your analysis,
Beg your pardon?
how would your analysis about Israel's main concerns, like the Egyptians and the other ones you mentioned, change if in the near future, certainly before Israel or America acts, Iran were to set off an atomic bomb?
Well, look, the Iranians are still 2 to 3 years away from getting nuclear weapons and certainly matching them up with missiles. There's a lot of sensationalist, crazy stuff, nonsense that's written. Israeli government has never said, hinted, or implied that Iran, and this is, the Egypt story has been covered horribly, this story has been covered horribly. The Israeli government has never said or implied that it believes that Iran is about to get nuclear weapons. What it has said very clearly but been ignored is two things. Number one, Iran will harden its installations so that they will be much harder to destroy. That's where we are now. And secondly of all, that Iran has reached the point of no return, meaning that they do not need significant foreign inputs. In other words, it's not that they have nuclear weapons, but that they can go ahead until the point that they get them, because they don't need to import anything. So we really need to understand what we're talking about here. So I do not believe that's going to happen. Now, my honest view is that it's extremely unlikely that Iran would attack Israel with nuclear weapons. That if Israel attacks Iran, it makes it far more likely that someday Iran will attack Israel with nuclear weapons. That my view is that Iran has shown itself to be a reasonably rational actor in Middle East terms. So I am not, chomping at the bit to attack Iran. But if the Israeli government is going to do that, and I will support the Israeli government, and I will work hard to try to figure out how we can deal with it to raise success, the likelihood of success, to the highest possible level. But the idea that sometime in the next 12 months Iran is going to launch nuclear weapons in Israel is absolute nonsense. And there's a lot of hysteria and there's a lot of false stuff. We know they hate us. We know they are our enemy. We know that, they want to wipe us off the face of the earth. But this is not the first time in the last 60 years that we've had to deal with that. The question is, what is their capability and willingness to do stuff? But again, I said that argument, we're now past my argument. And we're into the era when, now, this is not going to happen in 2012. Why? I mean, listen to what the Barak says. He said, Israel's position is that it will attack Iran at the point where they are near to getting nuclear weapons, and we are not at that point. One of the most important things that a serious political analyst in the Middle East has to do is to ignore what the media says and to look at the statements and actions of political leaders. So I implore you, don't accept this nonsense. No, let's be frank here. What we have just been through is an Israeli disinformation effort to create the appearance of a war crisis in order to press the world to do more. One, press the world to do more for sanctions against Iran. And two, to support Israel if and when in the future Israel attacked Iran. And that campaign succeeded brilliantly. Now, people say, I mean, people on the left in the US are everything, oh, Obama really told Netanyahu off and he stopped him from, slapped him down and he stopped him from attacking Iran. I mean, does anybody who's saying, meaning people who don't teach at Western universities and white American mass media, I mean, does anyone think that Bibi Netanyahu went to Washington thinking that Obama was going to say, yes, I agree with you, attack Iran right now? I mean, no, because we have a realistic leadership. So what was their goal? It was to get approval in principle, to lock in the U.S. government to this position. And that is what Obama said in his speech. One, I understand that Israel believes that it cannot, and I agree with, that Israel cannot live with Iran that has nuclear weapons. Two, Iran having nuclear weapons is devastatingly bad for U.S. interests. Three, U.S. policy is not a policy of containment. It's a policy of preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons by any means necessary. Now, I submit that Obama has given Israel a green light to attack Iran, as long as it comes further down the road after the election. If he loses, what he thinks won't matter. But if he wins, he'll be locked into whatever he prefers. Okay, these people, in many ways, people in the Obama administration are incompetent. They don't understand international, they make a lot of mistakes, they have a bad ideology, but that doesn't change the fact that we're dealing with the real world, not just what they want. Now, I don't want to take too much time here, but if I were to go through history, I make a case very persuasively that literally every war the United States has ever fought was fought on the basis of a commitment made by a president who did not want to implement it. A simple one. Woodrow Wilson ran sincerely on the program. He kept us out of war. And then he took the United States into war with Germany in World War I. Why did he do that? Because he was a liar? No, because the Germans restarted unrestricted submarine warfare. And the U.S. position was, if they torpedo American ships, the United States will go to war. Later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in a great humanitarian action has never really been properly recognized, put sanctions on Japan to punish Japan for its aggression and mass murders in China. Okay? And Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. When Roosevelt put sanctions on Iran, he didn't intend that to lead to an Japanese attack, but he made that commitment. What is the name of the Prime Minister of Great Britain who led Great Britain into war with Nazi Germany in 1939? Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain, the British government, guaranteed Poland over and over and over again. This is what history has shown, and I can give many other examples. So, and what's the problem here? And it's a problem illustrative of a wider problem. You got two sides. One side focuses on Obama is horrible and evil and everything he does is bad. The other side says Obama is great and wonderful and brilliantly, put down the evil people. Well, they're both wrong because they're not engaging with the facts and the realities. They have an agenda, an ideology, and approach. Now, what we have to do is to approach every problem using our brains, our experience, and primary source material. And that's an example. But if you think that the Iranian regime is crazy and can't wait to martyr itself, and believes it's going to bring the 12th Imam next Thursday, and that's what's going on here, I really would submit to you don't really know very much about Iran. That's not the way it works. But, again, if we're locked into an attack on Iranian nuclear facilities, then we have to deal with that reality, and we have to prepare for that reality. Thank you.
Next question.
Mr. Rubin, you haven't mentioned...
Please wait for the microphone.
Yes. Mr. Rubin, you haven't mentioned Jordan, which is our next door.
Actually, did mention Jordan briefly.
Sorry. It seems that it's on shaky grounds and there's going to be regime change. And as the majority of the population is Palestinian, how can we...
Questions on Jordan. I don't think Jordan is on shaky ground. Look, let's take a step back and look at what's happening. In countries where the army wanted there to be regime change, or there was a high level of international intervention, which by the way also applies to Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Libya, there was regime change. In countries where the army supported the regime and there wasn't massive intervention against the regime survived. No, I don't think Jordan is on shaky ground. I don't think Saudi Arabia is on shaky ground. They have won, and they won in Bahrain because they got that international support. These regimes, by the way, remember, I don't say these things lightly because I know my reputation is on the line, and if I prove to be wrong, nobody will probably forget it. I think that these regimes have survived the quote Arab Spring unquote. Also, Palestinian may be a majority in Jordan, but there are deep divisions among them. So I would bet on, and by the way, the funny thing is, I was saying this 20 and 30 years ago when it proved right. I would bet on the Jordanian regime, I would bet on the Saudi regime, I would bet on the Moroccan regime, I would bet on the Algerian regime, because these people they have the elite and the military are basically united to retain the regime, and they're willing to fight and, this being the Middle East, kill people to stay in power. So I reject that premise. So that's, by the way, another ground for optimism. Thank you.
Many of you have questions, I'm sure, that you'll find the answers in this book. Professor Rubin will be downstairs to autograph that for you. Final reminder, this Wednesday, 2:30, the Ladies' Organization, pre-Passover planning, I think will be very helpful to you. Rabbi Shmuel Hershler, outstanding speaker, will address the group. Remember to turn on your telephones. Thank you very much, Professor Rubin.